All right, this video is designed to give everyone the basics that they need in terms of the background of universal design for learning regarding the principles, guidelines, and checkpoints so that you'll be prepared to develop your UDL lesson. The first thing that I always talk about when I'm talking about UDL is this myth of the average. There's a great book by Todd Rose called The End of Average, and he talks about the origins of the theories basically in human anatomy and the idea that if you look at humans, there is no average size human. When you add up all our parts and divide them, yes, you might get some kind of average, but that's essentially meaningless. And there is actually quite a bit of a transfer from that fact that there's no such average physically to the idea that there's no average cognitively. When you look at any student, the profile of any student, be they benefiting from learning support, English as an additional language, or a student that's not receiving any additional support, all of us, you, myself, all of us, have this what we call spiky profile. Some aspects of our cognition are going to be in the high range, some may be in the average range, and some may be in the low range. And so when you look at all these, really depending on what we're doing in the classroom, some students are going to be bringing advantages and some students are going to be facing barriers and hurdles to learning. And the idea with universal design for learning is to plan with this diversity in mind, knowing that no one exists there in the middle, certainly not any individual, let alone an actual class. So using the principles, guidelines, and checkpoints of universal design for learning, we want to make sure that we are designing and delivering lessons and assessing students in a way that takes into account this diversity that we know exists. All right, the primary tool that I would like us all to be familiar with, especially when it comes to unit and lesson planning, is this Universal Design for Learning Guidelines chart. It is so helpful, and it really distills what can come across as an extremely complicated thing to something fairly simple. And so I'm going to go through this and break it down for you. But what I would hope is that when we are doing our planning, whether it's co-planning with a learning support teacher, EAL teacher, or head of department, other folks in our department, or even just on our own, the hope is that you are going to be using this as your guide. There are endless resources, videos, but I think if we can all get to a point where we understand this chart and use this as a chart to guide our planning and as a problem-solving tool, I think we'll be taking leaps, great leaps forward as a school in terms of making sure that we are planning for the diversity of students that we know exists in our classrooms. All right, so the first thing I like to start off with is just mentioning the fact that a lot of research has gone into this. The CAST Institute, which I believe has the best resources for universal design for learning, is based in Harvard in the United States. And so everything they're doing is based on the latest research, and most of their things are actually online because they update their resources constantly based on the new research that's coming. So this first aspect of the different pillars of universal design for learning, what they call the principles, are the why, the what, and the how of learning. And so the why of learning is really about our emotional network, our affective network. And you can see the green circle, which represents the inner core of the brain around the amygdala, for example, where we know a lot of our emotions are processed. We want to know what the why is. And so if we know what the why is for learning, we can get more engagement. And so the first principle of universal design for learning is to provide students with multiple means of engagement, trying to get them excited and interested and challenged in different ways. The second is the what of learning. And this really corresponds to the visual and auditory cortex of the brain, the visual being the largest part of the brain. What we want to do is make sure that when we are designing our lessons, we are providing for multiple means of representation. That means we are giving visuals, we are providing written text for students to go back to, maybe providing some video recordings that they can stop or rewind or slow down or speed up depending on their needs. And then finally, the last principle of universal design for learning is the how. of learning. And that really gets, you can see it's at the prefrontal cortex where we do, a lot of our planning and organizing, and they call it the strategic network or the how of learning. So this is really the action and expression portion of Universal Design for Learning, trying to provide multiple ways, multiple means of allowing students to act on their learning and express their learning. This one I think can be one of the more complicated ones, but when we are able to fully actualize it, students are much better able to show what they know and they can do. All right, a little bit more about how to read this chart. So we've already looked at the networks in the brain. So here we have the affective network, which governs engagement, and we want to find multiple means of engagement. We have the recognition network. This is our visual and auditory cortex. That's where we see and hear and process information as it comes in. We want to make sure we're providing multiple means of representation. And then finally, we have our strategic network. This is where our organization and planning skills come into play. And we want to make sure that we are providing multiple means of action and expression for students so that they can exercise and practice that. Another important piece is understanding the flow of this chart. So basically, this chart flows from top to bottom. So recognizing the organic background of our bodies, how we process information, how we're motivated, how we express what we know and learn. That's what it starts with. And then on the top, we have what UDL refers to as access. And these are things that these are the baselines of learning. This is where teachers are really providing the entry points and the supports for students. As students build on the universally designed experiences, they can then start to internalize what they've learned. So these first two stages, I would say, are really based on what the teachers are doing. And then the final stage, you're progressing towards independence. So the students have internalized what you've taught them. You've helped them sustain effort and persist. You've helped them decode language and symbols. You've helped them find multiple ways of communicating. Then they get to this part where they're really self-regulating. They're able to focus on making sure that they're comprehending, they're monitoring their comprehension, and they are in charge of their own executive functioning, organizing, planning, and setting goals. Finally, you have down here, which is the goal of UDL in a nutshell. It's just we want to develop expert learners. And what are expert learners? Expert learners are purposeful and motivated. They are resourceful and knowledgeable, and they have they're strategic and goal directed. The idea with Universal Design for Learning, and one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it, is that Universal Design for Learning is designed to take us out of a job as educators, because we want students to have internalized all of these skills on their own and become expert learners. All right, I've already talked about expert learners, but I think it's important just to reiterate, this is the ultimate goal. When we look at our ATLs, obviously as an IB school, the approaches to learning skills are extremely important. We could take all of the categories and clusters and all of the 180 plus skills in the approaches to learning, and I guarantee we could organize them by these three categories, because if you are an expert learner, you are a master of the approaches to learning skills. To dig a little bit deeper, I want to make sure that we understand how to read this. There is some terminology that is helpful for us to know when we're talking about this chart. So the first thing is that engagement, representation, and action, these are the principles of Universal Design for Learning. These are the ones that are based on the neuroscience. Next, we have what we call the guidelines. So the guidelines are the overarching areas that we want to look at that correspond to sub-skills, which we call the checkpoints. And so let's just use this one as an example. So under the principle of engagement, multiple means of engagement, where we're activating the affective network, really trying to use what we know about the brain to help the students become expert learners, we want to help them, in this example, with this guideline, sustain effort and persist. How do we do that? This is where the rubber hits the road for me. This is where it's no longer theoretical. This is where, as educators, we get to decide, okay, it's great to get them engaged. It's great to help them sustain effort, but how do we do that? And so one of the ways that we do that is to increase mastery-oriented feedback. And so there's specific ways, there are strategies aligned to this checkpoint, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, in the next page through the goal book online, where teachers can go and say, this is really the barrier. Students struggle to know what they need to do next to improve these skills. So I need to help them access and improve my mastery-oriented feedback towards students. So identifying what that checkpoint is that you're focusing on allows you to direct it to a strategy. So here is the second to last slide. We're about to wrap up. Here is an example of the research that goes with this. So our checkpoint 8.4, this is about mastery-oriented feedback. This is again from the CAST Institute. They give you a summary of the research. This is one paragraph, which really helps you understand the importance of mastery-oriented feedback. And they give you the citations for the seminal articles that go along with it. That's one of the things that I love about it. You have this guidance, and then they're going to back up everything they do in research, and they're updating it all the time. As a teacher, when you're doing lesson plans, you have zero time to look at the research. They've done it for you. But if you want to go and check it out and understand it better, it is there. Where you are most interested in spending your time, I'm sure, is saying, okay, we know what the principle is we want to focus on because we've identified our barriers to learning. We know what the guideline is. We want to make sure that we're helping students focus and sustain their efforts. How do I do that? So if we're saying mastery-oriented feedback is the way that Universal Design for Learning is saying that we should do that, what is an example of how I can increase mastery-oriented feedback? And that's where this goal book, and there's a link down here to how to get to that webpage. This is where it comes in, and I think it's just a super key resource for us to focus on. And that's a major part of this module, is here are some strategies. So using a feedback rubric, individual reading conferences, writing conferences, math flashcards, all of these are examples of things that will improve the delivery and the reception of mastery-oriented feedback. Now, on the goal book, each one of these, you can hover over them and a little bubble will pop up and it will explain the strategy, or you can simply Google that strategy and see how it works and try it out in your classroom. All right, this was our introduction to Universal Design for Learning. There are tons of other resources out there. All of these books are scanned and linked to in our upper school SharePoint. You can find them under the teacher resources of UDL, teacher resources. So please feel free to go in there and check them out and dig deeper in depth. And there are also tons of research, tons of sites online that cite the research. There's tons of stuff happening with UDL. I hope that you have a chance to dig deeper into these